I didn't even have the decency to tell her himself. The note arrived folded in thirds, no envelope, no seal. Just a scrap of paper pressed into the hand of a boy no older than 10, who shoved it through Adeline's door and ran before she could ask a single question. She stood in the middle of her cabin, still holding the hairpin she'd been about to use, and read it in under 15 seconds. That was all the time it took for Thomas Bellard to unravel every quiet hope she'd spent the last 3 months carefully, foolishly building. Something came up. Won't be able to make it tonight. T. That was it. No apology, no explanation. Just 7 words and an initial, like she wasn't even worth a full signature. Adeline read it again. Then a third time, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less cruel. They didn't. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now, because stories like Adeline's are exactly what this channel is built on. Real emotion, real consequences, real people making impossible choices. Drop a comment below and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely want to know how far this story travels. And if you stay until the end, I promise you, what happens to Adeline Rowan will stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Now, let's go back to that cabin. The date was August 23rd, 1883, and Blackridge, Kansas was the kind of town that lived for its annual harvest dance, the way a drowning man lives for a rope. One night a year, the dust settled, the fiddles came out. The lanterns got strung between the cottonwood trees behind the community hall, and for a few hours, people forgot how hard everything else was. Farmers forgot their failing crops. Widows forgot their empty chairs. Young women forgot that the frontier had a way of aging a person from the inside out long before the face showed it. Adeline Rowan was 27 years old, and she had not forgotten a single thing. She just didn't talk about it. She lived alone on 20 acres that her father, James Rowan, had left her when he died of a lung fever 2 winters back. The land wasn't much to look at. A creek that ran dry by July most years, soil that needed twice the coaxing of the richer plots to the north. But her father had loved it with a stubbornness that bordered on the irrational, and she had inherited that stubbornness right along with the deed. She raised chickens. She grew what she could. She took in mending work from 3 families in town, and she kept her accounts precise to the penny in a little leather ledger her father had given her when she turned 18. She did not ask for charity. She did not accept pity. And she had, until that August evening, allowed herself exactly one indulgence: the quiet, private pleasure of believing that Thomas Bellard actually meant what he said. He'd asked her to the harvest dance 6 weeks earlier, on a Tuesday afternoon when she'd brought his mother's altered dress to the Bellard house on the north edge of town. He'd been sitting on the porch, and he'd stood up when he saw her coming, which she'd noted, because most men in Blackridge didn't bother, and he'd smiled at her with that easy, sun-weathered smile of his and said, "Miss Rowan, I've been meaning to ask you something." She'd said yes before he even finished the sentence, and then she'd walked home feeling something she hadn't felt in a long, long time. Like the future might actually be kind to her. 6 weeks. She'd let herself believe it for 6 weeks. Now she stood in the middle of her cabin, hairpin in one hand, crumpled note in the other, and the light outside was already turning that particular shade of amber that meant she had maybe 2 hours before the dance began. Her best dress, the one with the cream-colored collar and the tiny pearl buttons she'd sewn on herself, was already laid out on the bed. She'd pressed it twice that week. She'd braided dried lavender into her wardrobe to keep it smelling clean. She set the note down on the table. She did not cry. She wanted to. The urge rose up in her chest like floodwater pushing against a door, hot and insistent and shameful in a way she couldn't entirely explain. But she pressed her lips together and breathed through her nose and refused. "He is not worth your tears," she told herself. And she said it the way her mother used to say things, flat and final, like the last nail in a coffin lid. The question was what to do now. She could stay home. That was the obvious answer, the sensible answer, the answer that wouldn't require her to walk into that community hall alone and feel every pair of eyes in the room land on her at once. She could take off the dress, put away the lavender, eat whatever was left in the pot from yesterday, and go to bed with the practical dignity of a woman who had simply decided not to go. She stood there for a long moment, looking at the dress on the bed. Then she picked up the hairpin, walked to the small mirror above the washstand, and started pinning her hair. She wasn't entirely sure why. There was no rational argument for it. There was only some stubborn, furious thing inside her that refused, absolutely refused, to give Thomas Bellard the satisfaction of keeping her indoors. Even if he never knew, even if no one ever knew, she would know. That was enough. She had just pressed the last pin into place when the knock came. It was not a soft knock, the kind that apologizes for itself. It was deliberate. 3 even raps, like someone who'd thought about it first. She turned from the mirror, smoothed the front of her dress out of habit, and crossed to the door. She opened it expecting nothing in particular. A neighbor with a question. The boy from town who sometimes brought her post. What she got was Sheriff Everett Kane. I was standing on her porch in his good shirt. Not his uniform, she noticed immediately. His good shirt, the dark gray one without the badge, holding his hat in both hands in front of him. He was a tall man, lean in the way of someone who had simply never had the spare time to be otherwise, with a jaw that looked like it had been cut out of something harder than ordinary bone. He was 34 years old, and he had the eyes of a man who had seen enough of human nature to stop being surprised by most of it. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them spoke for a moment that lasted just long enough to be uncomfortable. "Miss Rowan," he said. "Sheriff." He glanced past her into the cabin, just briefly, and then back at her face. "I heard you might be without an escort this evening." Adeline felt heat crawl up the back of her neck. Small towns, God help her, small towns. "Word travels fast," she said, and she didn't entirely manage to keep the edge out of it. "It does," he agreed without any hint of apology. "I'm going to the dance. I was going alone. Thought I'd see if you'd care to walk over together." He said it the same way he probably said everything. Matter of fact, unvarnished, no performance around it. There was no elaborate gallantry, no sweeping gesture, just an offer, delivered plainly, by a man who appeared to be entirely serious about it. Adeline studied him for a moment. She'd known Everett Kane the way everyone in Blackridge knew him, by reputation more than by conversation. He'd come to town 4 years ago, taking over the sheriff's position after his predecessor had the good sense to retire before someone else retired him. He didn't drink in public. He didn't gossip. He handled trouble with a particular economy of movement that people either respected or found unnerving, depending on their temperament. He had never, to her knowledge, courted anyone in Blackridge. He'd never spoken more than a dozen words to Adeline in the entire time she'd lived here. "Why?" she asked. He looked slightly surprised by the question. "Why what?" "Why are you offering? You don't have to." "No," he agreed. "I don't." He turned his hat once in his hands. "But it seems like a simple thing to do, and I'm going anyway. If you'd rather not, that's fine too." There was nothing prying in it, no undercurrent of wanting something from her. He wasn't offering out of pity, or if he was hiding it well enough that she couldn't catch the smell of it. He was simply standing on her porch in his good shirt, waiting for an answer. Adeline looked at him for another second. Then she reached behind herself and took her shawl from the hook by the door. "Let me get my gloves," she said. The walk to the community hall took 12 minutes. They filled perhaps 4 of them with actual conversation. He asked about the state of her creek, she answered honestly, and somewhere in the middle of it she heard herself laugh at something he said about the Hendersons' mule, and the sound surprised her. It had been a while since she'd laughed without having to think about it first. The hall was already lit when they arrived, lanterns glowing warm against the darkening sky. The sound of 2 fiddles and a badly tuned guitar spilling out through the propped open doors. Adeline could see this crowd gathered inside and outside the building, the women in their best dresses, the men scrubbed cleaner than nature generally intended, children darting between adult legs with the terrifying energy of small animals that had been cooped up too long. She slowed slightly as they reached the entrance. Old instinct. The awareness of eyes, of being watched, of the particular social mathematics that played out whenever a woman of her station arrived somewhere she wasn't entirely expected. Everett slowed with her, without comment, without making it a moment. He simply adjusted his pace to hers. "Ready?" he asked. "No," she said honestly. "That's all right," he said, and held open the door. The room did what rooms always do. Absorbed the new arrivals in a ripple of turned heads and murmured names. Adeline kept her chin level and her expression pleasant and did not look for Thomas Bellard in the crowd, even though some part of her was doing exactly that without her permission. She found him anyway. He was standing near the refreshment table with Clara Hutchins, the daughter of the wealthiest cattle rancher in the county, and he was laughing at something she'd said, and he had the relaxed, comfortable posture of a man who had not spent a single moment of his day worrying about the note he'd sent or the woman who'd received it. Something cold moved through Adeline's chest. Not grief exactly, more like the final, clean closing of a door she'd already been watching swing shut. She turned away from him. Everett was watching her, she realized. Not intrusively, just steadily, in the way he seemed to watch most things. "I know," she said, before he could say anything. "I wasn't going to say anything," he told her. "Good." The first hour of the dance was ordinary in the way that ordinary things sometimes become extraordinary in retrospect once you understand what was brewing beneath the surface. Everett danced with her twice, not badly, for a man who looked like he'd rather be almost anywhere else, and stood beside her without the uncomfortable chatter of a man trying too hard. When Mabel Porter came over and started asking pointed questions about the nature of their arrival together, Adeline watched Everett's expression shift into something that was not quite a smile and not quite a warning, and Mabel suddenly remembered something urgent on the other side of the room. "How did you do that?" Adeline asked, without thinking. "Practice," he said. She found herself looking at him differently after that. Not with romantic interest, or not yet. She was too newly bruised to reach for that. But with genuine curiosity. There was more architecture to this man than she'd understood. Depth she hadn't bothered to look for, because she'd had Thomas Bellard's empty smile to distract her. It was somewhere near the middle of the second hour that she stepped outside for air. She didn't plan to overhear anything. She had simply needed a breath that didn't taste like other people's perfume and the wood smoke from the indoor stove. She moved around the side of the building into the narrow shadow between the hall's outer wall and the storage shed behind it, and she stood there a moment, pressing her palm against the rough wood planks, listening to the fiddles mute themselves to something she could almost ignore. That was when she heard the voices. Two men, somewhere on the other side of the shed, speaking low, but not low enough. The kind of careless quiet that happens when people believe they're alone. Said it would be handled by now. She didn't sell. I know she didn't sell hair, that's what I just said. She didn't sell. Bellard was supposed to... Bellard lost his nerve. Or his spine. Take your pick. Point is, she's still sitting on that land, and Crow's not going to wait through another winter. Adeline stopped breathing. Then what? Then we try something else. Something she can't smile her way through. A pause. The scrape of boot leather on dirt. Crow wants that land before the survey crew comes through. Every piece around it is locked up. She's the last holdout. 20 acres standing between him and the biggest land deal this county's ever seen. And the railroad. What do you think? Why do you think every inch of this is worth 10 times what it was 3 years ago? It's coming through, and it's coming through exactly where Crow says it is, because Crow's the one who's been paying to make sure it does. The voices moved then, footsteps shifting, one of the men spitting on the ground, and Adeline pressed herself flat against the wall and did not move until the sound of them had receded back toward the hall. She stood in the dark for a long moment after they were gone. Her heart was going at a pace that made it hard to think clearly, and she needed to think clearly, so she breathed, slow and deliberate, until the noise in her chest settled into something she could work with. Thomas Bellard hadn't abandoned her for Clara Hutchins. He had been sent to her. 6 weeks of soft smiles and casual questions about the land. Does the creek run year-round? What did your father pay for the place? Have you ever thought about selling? All of it, every single moment she'd replayed in her mind with the bittersweet pleasure of something she'd believed in. All of it had been performance, manipulation, dressed up as courtship, a scheme wrapped in a man's easy smile. She felt sick. Then she felt something much colder and much steadier replace the sickness, rising up through her like water finding level. She needed to find Everett Kane. She came back into the hall through the side entrance and scanned the room without appearing to scan it, a skill she'd developed over years of navigating spaces where she had no ally, until she located him near the far wall, standing slightly apart from a cluster of farmers who were debating something about drainage. He saw her cross the room toward him. Something in his expression shifted, barely, but she caught it. A small tightening of attention, a readjustment, like a man who has just realized the conversation is about to matter. She reached him and stopped, and she kept her voice absolutely level and her face pleasantly neutral, because there were people everywhere, and walls in small towns were functionally transparent. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to keep looking relaxed while I do." To his credit, he did not look alarmed. His expression didn't change at all, except for a fractional lift of one eyebrow. "All right," he said. She told him what she'd heard. All of it. The names, the words, the railroad, Silas Crow. She kept her voice low and even, and her eyes drifting casually around the room as she spoke, as if they were discussing the weather or the quality of the punch. When she finished, there was a pause, short but dense. "How many people know you overheard that?" he asked. "No one. They didn't know I was there." He nodded once. "Good. Don't tell them." "I wasn't planning to." He looked at her then, really looked at her, in a way that was different from the way he'd been looking at her all evening, like he was recalibrating something. "Silas Crow," he said quietly. "You're sure that was the name?" "I'm sure," she said. "You know him?" "I know of him." He said it in a tone that carried a great deal of information in very few words. "He operates out of Salinas. Land dealings, mostly, but the legal kind on paper and something else underneath." He paused. "I've been watching something here in Blackridge for about 4 months. Didn't have enough to pull on yet. Didn't know what the thread connected to." Adeline absorbed this. "And now?" "Now I think you just handed me the thread." She felt the weight of that settle over her, and she recognized it for what it was. Not just information, but a choice. She could hand this to Everett and step back, remove herself, let the law handle it like a sensible person. Or she could understand that her name, her land, her father's 20 acres were already at the center of this, whether she chose to be or not, and act accordingly. "What do we do?" she asked. He looked at her. "We don't do anything tonight. Tonight you enjoy the dance. You smile at Bellard if you have to. You give absolutely no one in this room any reason to think you heard a single word." She nodded. "And tomorrow," he said, "I'll come by your place. We talk then, properly." "All right." There was a pause. The fiddles had shifted into something slower, and around them couples were drifting toward the center of the room. "One more dance?" he said. Not romantically, practically. Because a woman who'd come with a man and then stood talking to him in a corner for 10 minutes needed to be seen on the dance floor, or the wrong version of events would circulate before morning. "One more," she agreed. She danced with him, and she kept her expression light and her movements easy, and she did not look in the direction of Thomas Bellard even once. She was already somewhere else in her mind, turning over the pieces of what she'd heard, arranging and rearranging them, feeling the edges of something vast and dangerous taking shape beneath the ordinary surface of this ordinary night. Her father had loved that land with what everyone in town had called stubbornness, irrationality, a farmer's blind attachment to dirt. It turned out James Rowan had known something that nobody else knew, and someone had been watching that land and watching his daughter for a very long time. The dance ended. The lanterns swayed. Around her, Blackridge laughed and clapped and spun in the warm summer dark, completely unaware. Adeline Rowan smiled and said the right things to the right people, and walked home afterward in the particular silence of a woman who has just understood that her life is considerably more complicated than it was this morning, and who has already, quietly, begun deciding what to do about it. She didn't sleep that night, not for lack of trying. She lay on her back in the dark, with her hands folded over her stomach, and stared at the ceiling and listened to the creak, what was left of it, make its thin, tired sound outside the window, and she went over the conversation behind the shed again and again, the way you press a bruise to confirm it's still there. Every word. The names. The tone of the man who'd said something she can't smile her way through. The casual certainty of it. The way he'd said Crow's name like it was a fixed point in the universe, like the man himself was as inevitable as weather. She thought about her father. James Rowan had bought those 20 acres in 1861 for less money than most men spent on a good horse, and everyone in the county had told him he was a fool. The soil wasn't the best, the water wasn't reliable. The location was neither here nor there, too far from town to be convenient, too close to be truly isolated. For years the land had produced just enough to keep them alive, and not quite enough to make anyone envious. That had always seemed to Adeline like the essential story of her family, surviving without inspiring covetousness. Slipping through life beneath the level at which things get taken from you. She understood now that she'd been wrong about that. She understood now that her father had known something, or suspected something, that he'd never told her directly, and the fact that he hadn't was either wisdom or a failure of nerve, and she wasn't sure which, and she wasn't sure it mattered anymore. What mattered was the 20 acres. What mattered was Silas Crow. What mattered was that somewhere between the harvest dance and the walk home, the quiet, careful life she'd built after her father's death had revealed itself to be a great deal more precarious than she'd understood. She got up before dawn, dressed in her work clothes, and made coffee, and sat at the table with her father's ledger open in front of her, even though she wasn't reading it. She was thinking. And by the time the light outside had shifted from black to the particular gray-blue of very early morning, she had arrived at a decision that felt less like courage and more like the absence of any acceptable alternative. She was not going to sell. She was not going to pretend she hadn't heard what she'd heard. And she was not going to wait passively for Everett Kane to come to her with a plan. She wrote 3 things down in the margin of the ledger, in her small, precise handwriting: Crow, Railroad, Bellard. Then she closed the book and waited for the day to begin. Everett arrived mid-morning, as he'd said he would. He came on horseback and tied the animal to the fence post with the practiced efficiency of a man who didn't waste motion, and he knocked the same way he had the night before. 3 even raps, deliberate and unhurried. She had the door open before the 3rd knock finished. He looked at her face and said without preamble, "You didn't sleep." "No," she agreed. "Come in." He sat at her table. She set coffee in front of him and sat across from him, and for a moment neither of them spoke. There was a quality to his silence that she'd begun to notice. It wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it wasn't empty either. It was the silence of a man who was still thinking, still sorting, still running calculations she couldn't see. "Tell me about your land," he said finally. She told him everything: the purchase price, the acreage, the creek, the soil composition, the way her father had mapped the property lines himself with a hand compass, and a stubbornness that had driven the county surveyor half mad. She told him about the conversations her father had had with neighboring landowners, the Hendersons to the north, the Parrish family to the east, and the quiet, persistent way he'd encouraged them to hold their properties even when the drought years made selling look like sense. Everett listened without interrupting. He had a way of listening that made you say more than you'd planned to, not through any trick, but through the simple attention of someone who appeared to be actually processing your words rather than waiting for his turn to speak. When she finished, he said, "Your father ever mention a man named Crow?" "Not by name." "Anyone? Anyone who came around asking about the land?" She thought about it. "There was a man, maybe 2 years ago, about 6 months before my father died. He came out twice, said he was from a development company in Wichita. My father told him the land wasn't for sale and sent him off, and I thought that was the end of it." "What did this man look like?" "Tall, thin, well-dressed for this county, clothes that didn't belong here, brown coat, gold watch chain. He had a way of smiling that didn't reach his eyes." Everett set his coffee cup down. "That was Roy Heron. He works for Crow. Does the initial approach, the friendly one, before things get less friendly." Adeline absorbed this. "So it's been going on that long?" "Longer, probably. Crow's been buying land along this corridor for at least 3 years that I can document. He works slowly, buys the willing sellers first, isolates the holdouts, then applies pressure at the points where people are most vulnerable." He paused. "A woman living alone on contested land is a point of vulnerability. He'd have identified that early." She didn't flinch at it, even though something in her wanted to. "And Bellard?" "Thomas Bellard has a debt problem. Has had one for about 2 years. Bad crop year, some poor choices at the card table, a loan from a man in Wichita I'd very much like to have a longer conversation with." Everett's voice was even, but there was something underneath it, a controlled quality, like a door being held shut with some effort. "He's not a bad man exactly. He's a weak one, which in some ways makes him more dangerous, because weak men do things that bad men wouldn't bother with." "He came to me," Adeline said. "He was kind to me. He asked about my father." She heard the flatness in her own voice and recognized it for what it was. Not grief over Thomas Bellard, not really, but grief over her own willingness to be fooled. That was the part that was harder to digest. "I should have known." "How?" Everett said, without inflection. She looked at him. "He's been doing this for 2 years," Everett said. "Practiced, coached, I'd imagine. And you weren't looking for it because you had no reason to be." He picked up his coffee, drank, set it back down. Don't do that to yourself. It doesn't help anything. It was not a comforting speech. It wasn't meant to be. But it was, she realized, the most genuinely useful thing anyone had said to her since the note arrived. Not "you couldn't have known," which was soft and forgiving in a way that felt like condescension. But it doesn't help anything. Functional, forward-facing, treating her like a person with capacity for reason rather than a woman in need of soothing. She found herself revising her opinion of Everett Kane again, upward this time. "So what do we do?" she said. He leaned back in the chair, which creaked under him with the particular protest of old wood, and looked at the table between them with the expression of a man selecting between options he doesn't love equally. "What I want to do is ride to Salinas and drag Crow back here by the collar. What I can do is considerably less satisfying." "Which is?" "Build a case. A real one. The kind that survives a trial and a defense attorney and a judge who may or may not have his own connections to people like Crow." He looked up at her. "What you overheard last night is useful, but it's your word against theirs, and they'll say you misunderstood, or that you're a woman with a grudge, or both. I need documentation. I need witnesses who'll talk. I need a pattern I can put in front of a federal marshal that's too clean and too consistent to dismiss." "That takes time," she said. "Yes," he said, "and while we're building this case, Crow keeps operating." "Yes," he said again, "and his people will try again. Different approach, maybe more direct." She let that sit in the air between them for a moment. "You're telling me to hold still and be a target." "I'm telling you to hold still and look like you don't know you're a target," he said. "There's a difference." It was not a comfortable distinction, but she understood the logic of it. The same way she understood that sometimes, in a bad winter, you burned your least essential furniture before you burned your essential furniture, and you did it in the right order, and you didn't panic. "All right," she said, "what do you need from me?" What he needed, it turned out, was considerably more than she'd expected. Over the following days, Everett moved through the county with the quiet, methodical energy of a man who had been preparing for exactly this problem without knowing quite what shape it would take. He visited the Henderson farm first. Owen Henderson, 61 years old, who had sold his property the previous spring after a series of what he'd described to his daughter as bad luck, but which had involved, on closer examination, a fence fire, a contaminated well, and two of his horses going lame within a week of each other. Henderson had been reluctant to talk. He'd signed papers. He'd taken the money. He was afraid of what talking might cost him. Everett spent 3 hours at the Henderson table, drinking bad coffee and listening, and he left with 2 pages of handwritten notes and Henderson's shaking promise that he'd say what he knew if it came to that. He visited the Parrish family east of Adeline's property, and the Cutler widow on the south end, and a man named Beecham who'd left his land entirely and moved his family to Dodge City the previous autumn after what everyone in Blackridge had written off as a simple case of poor farming decisions. Beecham, it emerged, had not moved because he'd failed. He'd moved because a man had come to his door in the middle of the night and described, in calm and clinical detail, what could happen to a family that was stubborn about these things. None of this had been reported. None of it had gone in a record anywhere. People were afraid, and fear in small towns had a particular texture. It spread without announcing itself. It made reasonable people quiet. It disguised itself as private decision-making and personal choice until you stepped back far enough to see the pattern. Adeline helped him in the ways she could. She had a network that Everett didn't, not because she was better connected, but because she was a woman who did mending work, and women who did mending work moved through households in ways that a sheriff never could. She visited 3 families under the guise of returning finished work. She asked careful questions. She listened. She brought back 2 names Everett hadn't had, and a detail about a man who'd been seen surveying the land corridor on the eastern edge of the county on a morning when he'd told the local postmaster he was a representative of the Kansas Land Office. He was not a representative of the Kansas Land Office. "You're good at this," Everett said, on the 5th day, when she laid her notes beside his on the kitchen table, and they compared them in the particular focused silence of people working toward a shared problem. She glanced up. "At what?" "Getting people to tell you things." "People tell women things," she said a little dryly. "We're not considered threatening enough to warrant caution." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. "That's their mistake," he said, and went back to his notes. She thought about that later, when he'd left. The simple way he'd said it, not as a compliment exactly, more as an assessment. The same tone he'd used to describe the load capacity of a wagon or the reliability of a particular road. He observed things and stated what he observed, and somewhere in the last several days she had begun to find that quality more reassuring than any amount of careful, courteous flattery. It was on the 8th day after the harvest dance that the first direct threat arrived. She was in the yard, feeding her chickens, when a rider she didn't recognize came down her lane at a pace that was not quite casual and stopped 10 feet from where she stood. He was a broad, heavy-shouldered man in a duster coat, with the weathered, incurious face of someone who had been doing unpleasant errands for other people long enough that the unpleasantness no longer registered. "Miss Rowan," he said, without taking off his hat. "That's right," she said. She kept her voice even and did not set down the bucket of feed, because setting it down would have looked like she was preparing for something, and she didn't want him to know she was preparing for anything. "Mr. Crow asks that you reconsider his offer on the property." "Mr. Crow hasn't made me an offer," she said. The man studied her with flat eyes. "He will. He wanted to know first if you'd be open to a conversation." "I'm always open to a conversation," she said. "Tell him to put it in writing and send it through the proper channels." A pause. Something shifted slightly in the man's expression. Not anger, more like recalibration. He'd been expecting something different, tears maybe, or nervous eagerness, or the kind of exhausted capitulation that follows weeks of isolated pressure. "The offer will be fair," he said. "I'm sure it will," she said pleasantly. "Good day." She went back to feeding the chickens and did not watch him right away, even though every nerve in her body was tracking the sound of his horse until it faded entirely down the lane. She told Everett that afternoon. "Heron?" he asked. "No, bigger man. Duster coat. Didn't give his name." "That's Cobb. Del Cobb." Something in Everett's jaw tightened, just slightly. "He's the one who went to Beecham in the middle of the night." She held that thought for a moment. "He was very polite." "He's always polite the first time," Everett said. "Second time is different." "Then we'd better make sure there isn't a second time," she said. He looked at her. She looked back. It occurred to her, in a way that felt faintly absurd given the circumstances, that she had never in her adult life had a conversation partner quite like this. Someone who matched her register exactly, who didn't soften things to protect her and didn't inflate them to frighten her, who simply operated in the same factual territory she did and appeared to find that unremarkable. "I'm going to ask something," Everett said, "and I want an honest answer." "When have I given you a dishonest one?" "Fair point." He looked at the table for a moment. "Are you frightened?" She considered the question seriously, the way it deserved. "Yes," she said, "but I'm not frightened enough to be stupid about it." He nodded once, as if this were a perfectly acceptable answer, which she supposed it was. The next 2 weeks were a particular kind of endurance, not dramatic, not explosive, but grinding in a way that required a different type of courage than the sharp, clear-edged kind. The pressure came in small ways. A delivery she was expecting from town didn't arrive. 2 families who had previously been friendly suddenly went cool and distant in the specific manner of people who have been told something unflattering about you and aren't sure yet whether to believe it. She heard, through the reliable mechanism of Mabel Porter's inability to keep anything to herself, that a rumor had begun circulating, something vague and damaging about the legitimacy of her father's land deed, about a supposed dispute with a creditor before his death. It was fabricated. She knew that the same way she knew the shape of her own name. But fabrication spread in small towns with the same efficiency as truth, and sometimes faster, and the goal wasn't to prove anything legally. The goal was to make her feel isolated, unreliable in the eyes of her neighbors, too socially embattled to mount effective resistance. She went to town anyway. She was polite to people who were cold to her. She did not defend herself against the rumor directly, because defending yourself against a rumor was the surest way to keep it alive. She waited, and she kept records, dates, names, incidents, in the back of her father's ledger with the same small, precise handwriting she'd used all her life. It was during this period that something between her and Everett began to shift. She couldn't have named the exact moment. It happened in the accumulation of ordinary things, the way he had started arriving without knocking, and she had stopped being surprised by it, the way their conversations had developed a shorthand that assumed shared context rather than starting from the beginning each time, The way he'd begun leaving small things at her place without comment. A bag of coffee she hadn't asked for, a shutter hinge that had been loose for 2 months, replaced while she was inside, and she'd only noticed because the shutter suddenly closed cleanly. She'd mentioned the hinge to him later. "You didn't need to do that." "It was loose," he said, as if this were a complete explanation. Perhaps for him it was. She found herself thinking about him at odd moments, not in the distracted, dreamy way she'd once thought about Thomas Bellard, which she now understood to have been the mild infatuation of a lonely woman with a pleasant surface. This was different, quieter, more serious. She thought about the set of his shoulders when he was reading something he disagreed with, the way he looked away when he was embarrassed rather than doubling down, the scar along his left jaw that she'd been curious about for 2 weeks before she finally asked. "Dodge City," he said when she did. "4 years ago, before I came here." "Bad night?" "Year," he said. "Bad year." She waited, and he seemed to weigh something, and then he told her a version of it, abbreviated, selective, the kind of story that's told around its edges rather than through its center. A man he hadn't been fast enough to stop. A family that had suffered for it. The particular weight that attaches to a mistake you can't undo, regardless of what you do afterward. She listened without offering any of the useless comforts that people offer in those moments. That he'd done his best, that it wasn't his fault, that he needed to forgive himself. She just listened, and when he was finished, she said, "That's a heavy thing to carry into a new town." "Yes," he said. "You've been carrying it 4 years," she said. "Yes." She looked at him. "Does it get lighter?" Something crossed his face that she couldn't entirely read. "Some days." That was the conversation that changed things, though she didn't know it yet. Not in the obvious way. No declarations, no moments of cinematic clarity. Just a small shift in the way she thought about him. A reorientation, like a compass needle settling. He was not a simple man, and he was not a perfect one, and those two things together made him feel, for the first time in a long while, like someone real. It was Owen Henderson's daughter, May, who brought the evidence that broke the thing open. She came to Adeline's cabin on a Tuesday, unannounced, pale with something that was either determination or fear, possibly both. She was 22 years old, and she had her father's stubborn chin and her mother's anxious eyes, and she sat at Adeline's table and put her hands flat on the surface as if she needed to feel something solid. "I have something," she said. "I don't know if it matters. My father doesn't know I'm here. He'd say I was making things worse." "Let me hear it," Adeline said. What May Henderson had was a letter, not addressed to her. It had come to her father months ago, before the fence fire, before the horses went lame, and it was from a man named Heron, and it laid out, in terms that were careful enough to seem merely commercial and specific enough to make the threat unmistakable, the consequences of Owen Henderson's continued refusal to sell. It was the kind of letter a lawyer might draft at the instruction of a client who was intelligent enough to want everything deniable, but impatient enough to put it in writing anyway. May had kept it. She hadn't told anyone. She'd hidden it in the lining of her winter coat and waited, and she'd spent 2 weeks after the harvest dance deciding whether Adeline Rowan was someone she could trust, and apparently she had arrived at yes. Adeline held the letter and read it once and then a second time, carefully, and she felt something settle in her chest with a weight that was almost like relief. "Does your father know you kept this?" "No." "He needs to know." May nodded, miserable. "I know. That's why I came here first." Adeline sent for Everett. He arrived within the hour. He read the letter standing at her kitchen table without sitting down. And he read it twice the same way she had, and when he looked up, his expression was the calmest she had ever seen it, which was somehow the most unsettling thing about it. "This is it," he said. "Is it enough?" "It's the thread I can pull." He set the letter down carefully. "I need to get this to the federal marshal in Topeka, and I need Henderson to go on record." "He won't want to," Adeline said. "No," Everett agreed. "People rarely want to do the things that need doing." He looked at May. "Your father is a good man who's been backed into a corner. I don't hold that against him. But I'm going to need him to decide which side of this he wants to end up on, and he needs to make that decision before Crow's people realize what we're holding." May Henderson sat with her hand still flat on the table, and she looked at the letter, And then she looked at Everett with the expression of someone who is deciding whether a rope they've been thrown is strong enough to hold their weight. "I'll talk to him," she said. "Tonight," Everett said. "Tonight," she agreed. After May left, the cabin was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind had come up, a dry, late summer wind that moved through the tall grass behind the property with a hissing sound that Adeline had always found either peaceful or ominous, depending on the state of things. And tonight the state of things was unclear enough that she couldn't decide which. "This is going to move fast now," Everett said. He was standing by the window looking out at the yard. "I know. They'll find out we have it. Maybe not right away, but they'll find out." "I know that too." He turned from the window and looked at her. There was something in his face she hadn't seen before, or hadn't let herself identify. Something that was working against the professional blankness he usually wore, pressing against it from the inside. "Adeline?" he said. It was the first time he'd used her given name. She noticed it, and from the slight pause that followed, so did he. "I need you to understand that what happens next may not be orderly. Crow doesn't strike me as a man who accepts exposure quietly." "No," she said. "I didn't imagine he would. If something happens, if there's trouble at this property." "I'm not leaving," she said, flat, final. He looked at her for a long moment. "I didn't ask you to." "Good." The silence that followed was different from the silences that had come before. More charged, more full of things that neither of them had put words to yet, and both of them knew it, and neither of them reached for those words yet, because there was too much unresolved, too much still in motion, and they were both, in their different ways, people who didn't speak until they knew what they were saying. But the awareness was there, settled in the room between them like a third presence, patient and unhurried. Everett put on his hat. "I'll be back in the morning. Lock the door tonight." "I always lock the door," she said. "I know," he said. "I just like knowing you will." He left. She listened to his horse move away down the lane, and she sat at the table with the empty coffee cups between them and her father's ledger in front of her, and she thought about 20 acres of unremarkable Kansas land that had turned out to be the center of something vast and deliberate and dangerous. She thought about her father, who had loved that land past all reason, who had sent away a man with a gold watch chain and refused to say why, who had died with a knowledge he hadn't quite passed on in time. She thought about May Henderson, 22 years old, sitting with her hands flat on a table and making the decision to trust someone. She thought about Everett Kane standing at her window, saying her name for the first time, and the particular quality of his voice when he did. Then she picked up her pen, opened the ledger to the margin page, and wrote underneath the 3 words she'd recorded the morning after the dance. Henderson letter. Heron's signature. Federal Marshal, Topeka. She capped the pen. The wind moved through the grass outside. Somewhere on the eastern edge of the property, something, a coyote probably, or just the dark in her own imagination, made a sound she didn't recognize, and she sat still for a moment, listening, and then she stood up and checked the lock on the door and went to bed. She did not sleep well, but she slept. Owen Henderson came to his daughter's defense 3 days after May's visit, which was 2 days later than Everett had hoped, and 1 day earlier than Adeline had expected, and the difference in their expectations said something accurate about the nature of frightened men making hard choices. He arrived at Adeline's cabin on a Thursday morning, hat in hand, literally, not figuratively, turning it around and around in his fingers the way men do when they've rehearsed what they want to say and still aren't sure it's going to come out right. He was a big man gone soft at the edges, with a farmer's permanent squint, and the specific kind of exhaustion that settles into a person's face after a prolonged period of being quietly afraid. He sat where May had sat 2 days before, and put his hands on the table the same way she had, and Adeline thought, that's where she learned it, that gesture, from watching him sit at his own kitchen table and hold himself together when things were falling apart. "May shouldn't have taken that letter," he said. "No," Adeline agreed, "but I'm glad she did." He looked at her with the guilty, defiant expression of a man who wants to be angry at someone and can't locate the right target. "If Crow finds out I gave testimony—" "He'll find out regardless," Adeline said. "That's how these things work. The question isn't whether he finds out. The question is whether he finds out before or after we've built something he can't tear down." Henderson was quiet for a moment. Outside, a meadowlark sang a single phrase and went silent. "My wife's buried on that land," he said. "The piece I sold. She's buried in the northeast corner, under the 2 cottonwoods. He looked at his hat. Crow's people said they'd keep it, said the grave would be respected. A pause that had something raw in it. I don't know why I believe them. Adeline didn't say anything for a moment. There was nothing to say that would help, and she'd learned, slowly, imperfectly, that the impulse to fill painful silences with words was more about your own discomfort than the other person's need. Tell Everett what you know, she said finally. Everything. Let him decide what's useful. Henderson looked up. And your land? Why are you holding it? You could take the money and go somewhere easier. She thought about that, really thought about it, because it deserved an honest answer rather than a righteous one. My father held it, she said. He had reasons I didn't fully understand while he was alive, and I'm starting to understand now, and I suppose I'm stubborn enough that I don't want a man like Crow to have it. She paused. That's not entirely noble, but it's honest. Something shifted in Henderson's face. Not quite a smile, but a loosening. All right, he said. I'll talk to Kane. He did. That same afternoon, in Everett's office at the edge of town, a room that smelled of wood dust and old paper and gun oil, which Adeline had visited exactly once before, and noted was both more organized and more sparse than she'd expected. Henderson sat in the single chair across from the desk and talked for 2 hours. Everett wrote. Adeline sat in the corner on an upturned crate, which Everett had offered to replace with a proper chair, and she'd declined, because she didn't intend to be there long and she didn't want to get comfortable and miss anything. What Henderson knew, once he started talking, was considerably more than he'd let on. He'd spoken to 3 other landowners before he sold, men who'd already capitulated, men who'd tried to resist and found their resistance costing them in ways that were hard to prove and impossible to ignore. He knew the name of the surveyor who'd been working the corridor under a false commission. He knew which bank in Wichita had been processing the land purchases, and he had the name of the banker, and he'd kept a copy of his own sale agreement in a tobacco tin under his floorboards because some part of him had known, even in the moment of signing, that he might need it someday. When he was done, the room was quiet. Everett looked at his notes. He looked at them for a long time. You should have come to me 6 months ago, he said. Not accusatory, just stating a fact that had a cost attached to it. I know, Henderson said. I wasn't ready to be brave yet. Everett looked up at him. You're here now. I'm here now, Henderson agreed. It wasn't absolution, and it wasn't meant to be. But it was something. The acknowledgement of a man who had arrived late and still arrived, which counted for something in a world where plenty of people never arrived at all. The following morning, Everett sent a detailed letter to the federal marshal's office in Topeka. He sent a second letter, separately, to a contact in the Kansas Attorney General's office, a man he'd worked with 3 years prior on a different kind of fraud, smaller in scale but similar in method. He did not tell Adeline about the second letter until after he'd sent it, which annoyed her briefly, and then she recognized it as the behavior of a man who was protecting her from the position of being a source of information rather than an operative, which was more complicated to feel about. I would have agreed to it, she said. I know, he said. I also know that the less you're documented as being involved in the legal strategy, the cleaner your position is if this goes to court. I'm already involved. You're a witness and a property holder, he said. That's different from being the person who initiated federal contact. One of those roles protects you. The other one makes you a target. She considered arguing and then didn't because he was right, and they both knew it. And spending energy on disagreements that had correct answers was a waste of something she couldn't afford. What she hadn't anticipated, what neither of them had quite calculated for, in the careful, methodical way they'd been building their case, was how fast Crow would move once he sensed the temperature changing. It started with Thomas Bellard. She saw him in town on a Friday, outside the dry goods store, and she made the choice in the half-second before he noticed her to stop and not look away. Because looking away was a concession she hadn't earned and he didn't deserve. And she was done, she realized, with the reflexive female politeness of pretending not to see things she saw clearly. He saw her. Something moved through his face, not guilt exactly, or not only guilt. Something more complicated. Shame, maybe, but shame that hadn't yet decided whether to harden into resentment or soften into accountability, and she could see him tipping between them. Miss Rowan, he said. Mr. Bellard, she said. He looked at the ground and then back up. I owe you an apology. Yes, she said. You do. He blinked. He'd been expecting something softer, she supposed. There were circumstances. There always are, she said. The circumstances don't change what you did. You know that. He was quiet for a moment. He looked genuinely wretched, which did not produce in her the sympathy it might once have. She'd used up a certain amount of sympathy on Thomas Bellard already, and she couldn't retrieve it, and she didn't particularly want to. Are you going to tell me what Crow offered you to do it? She said. His eyes came up sharply. How do you... Because I'm not stupid, she said, and neither is Sheriff Kane. The question is whether you're going to be stupid, whether you're going to hold Crow's hand right up until the moment the federal marshal arrives, or whether you're going to do the only thing left that has any dignity in it. The word federal landed on him visibly. His face went several different colors in rapid succession, and she watched the calculation happening behind his eyes. The hasty arithmetic of a man realizing that the situation he'd thought was contained had expanded well beyond anything he'd understood. What do you want from me? He said, and his voice had lost something, the ease, the warmth. Without those things, she could see the real shape of him, and it was smaller than she'd thought. Talk to Everett, she said, today, before someone tells you not to. She walked away and didn't look back, and she was half a block away when she heard him call after her. Not her name, just a sound, the uncertain beginning of something he didn't finish. She kept walking. Bellard went to Everett's office that afternoon. Adeline heard about it. Second-hand from Everett 2 hours later. A visit that had lasted 40 minutes and produced a written statement that Everett described as incomplete but usable. Bellard had not given them everything. He'd been careful, calculating his exposure as he went, offering enough to seem cooperative without offering what might condemn him most directly. But he'd given them Crow's name attached to a specific instruction. He'd confirmed the existence of a payment arrangement. And he'd mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Crow was planning to be in Blackridge within the week. He's coming here, Adeline said. Apparently the timeline has moved up. The railroad survey crew is coming through sooner than expected. Crow wants the last pieces locked up before the survey confirms the corridor. Everett's voice was careful. He's going to make you an offer directly. And when I refuse? That's what I'm concerned about. She looked at him. He was sitting at her table again. He spent a considerable amount of time at her table now, which she had stopped pretending not to notice. And there was a tension in him that he wasn't quite managing to keep below the surface. Not fear exactly, more like the coiled alertness of a man watching multiple moving pieces and running calculations about which one is most likely to go wrong first. You think it'll go past an offer this time, she said. Cobb doesn't make multiple polite visits, he said. That's not how he operates. The polite visit was the first step. The second step is... He stopped. Tell me, she said. Escalation, he said. Property damage, usually. Something that looks like bad luck. Or something that looks like a threat without quite being one. Close enough to frighten you. Far enough from the line that I can't arrest anyone for it. He looked at her steadily. I want you to stay in town. There's a room at the Parish House, Clara Parrish offered. She knows part of what's happening. No, Adeline said. Adeline, no. She said it with the same flatness she'd been using on this particular argument since the beginning, because it was not a new argument. If I leave this property, I'm signaling that I can be moved. Crow will know it worked, and then every piece of pressure he applies will be designed to make me leave, because he'll know that's the mechanism. She paused. I'm not leaving, but I'll take precautions. What kind of precautions? I thought you might have some ideas, she said, given that it's your job. He looked at her for a long moment. That evaluating look she'd come to recognize, the one where he was deciding something. And then he said, I'll have Ren Decker ride past twice a night. He's a deputy, he's reliable, and he's quiet enough that nobody'll notice the pattern. All right. And I'll come by mornings. You've been coming by mornings for 2 weeks, she said. I know. A pause. Now there's a reason besides the case. She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them elaborated on that because there was too much else pressing, and neither of them were people who moved quickly toward the things they weren't ready to say out loud. But it was there, the acknowledgement of it, sitting between them like a coin on the table that both of them had seen. Crow's man came back 4 days later, not Cobb this time. Two men she didn't recognize, younger, with the particular blankness of men hired for their lack of scruple rather than any specific skill. They came at mid-morning when the light was high and flat, and there was nowhere to hide in the open yard. She was at the woodpile when she heard them on the lane, and she straightened up and waited, and she kept her expression arranged into the same neutral, unhurried look she'd been practicing every time she expected something unpleasant. They stopped their horses 20 feet away. The taller one said, "Mr. Crow is prepared to offer you $400 for the property. Cash." $400. The land was worth twice that already, and worth 10 times that with the railroad coming, and they almost certainly knew she knew that. "I'm not selling," she said. "That's a lot of money for a woman alone," the other one said. Not threatening, not yet. Just informational, in the manner of a man underlining something he expects you to have missed. "It is," she agreed, "and I'm still not selling." The taller one leaned forward on his saddle horn. Mr. Crow doesn't like to be told no twice. "I'm aware of his preferences," she said. "They don't particularly govern my decisions." There was a beat of silence. The two men exchanged a look, the kind that carries a whole conversation in under a second, and she felt the air in the yard change. Something sharpened. She was aware of the woodpile 3 feet to her left, and the cabin door 15 feet behind her, and the distance between herself and either of them, and she was measuring all of it without letting any of that measurement show on her face. Then, from the lane behind the men, came the sound of a horse. Everett rode into the yard with the unhurried pace of a man who has simply arrived, not rushed, not alarmed, and that unhurriedness was itself a kind of language. He came even with the two strangers and stopped, and he looked at them with an expression so neutral it was almost blank, and he said, "Morning." Neither of them answered right away. "Help you with something?" he said, and his hand was resting on his thigh, close to nothing in particular, though they both looked at it anyway. "Just a business conversation," the tall one said. "Looks finished to me," Everett said. He looked at Adeline. "Finished?" "Finished," she confirmed. The two men held their positions for a moment longer than was comfortable, and Adeline watched Everett watch them with the patient certainty of a man who has no doubt about how this particular equation resolves, and she thought, he's done this before. Many times. He knows exactly how long it takes. It took about 12 seconds. Then the tall one backed his horse up, and the other followed, and they rode back down the lane without another word. Everett didn't speak until they were gone. Then he dismounted and tied his horse to the fence post and came to stand near her, not hovering, just present. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. "You were watching the lane." "I was watching the lane," he agreed. "I've been watching it every morning for a week." She looked at him. "How long have you been sitting out there?" "About 2 hours." Everett. "There's a good sight line from the east side of the Henderson Road," he said, in the tone of a man describing an entirely reasonable logistical arrangement. "You can see this property from 300 yards without being visible yourself." "That's—" She stopped because she wasn't sure what word she wanted. Excessive, maybe. Unnecessary. And then she thought about the two men backing their horses up, and she thought about Cobb, and she thought about what escalation looked like in practice, and she decided that what she actually felt was not any of those words. "Thank you," she said. He looked slightly uncomfortable, which was, she had come to understand, how he looked when something landed that he hadn't braced for. "I should have been closer," he said. "Next time." "There won't be a next time like that," she said, with a certainty she mostly felt. "They came to deliver the offer. It's been refused. What comes next is different." "Yes," he said. "It is." What came next arrived 2 nights later, and it was not what either of them had been bracing for, which was perhaps how it managed to arrive at all. She woke at 2 in the morning to the smell of smoke, not the soft domestic smell of a banked fire or a neighbor's chimney. Something sharper. Something with urgency in it. She was out of bed before she was fully conscious, the way that particular smell bypasses thought entirely and goes straight to the body, and she was at the window in 3 steps, and she could see it. A line of orange light along the base of her fence line, eating along the dry grass at the eastern edge of the property. The creek was dry. The well was 40 yards from the fence. There was no wind, which was the only mercy in it, because wind would have moved that fire to the cabin itself in under 10 minutes. She threw on her coat over her nightdress and grabbed the 2 buckets she kept by the door and ran. She worked for 20 minutes in the dark, alone, hauling water from the well and throwing it at the burning grass, in a rhythm that left no room for fear because fear required a kind of mental space she couldn't afford. The fire was not large. Whoever set it had not intended, apparently, to burn her out entirely. Just to make a point. Just to demonstrate a capability. A controlled message delivered in fire, which was the kind of thing that required a very particular type of person to arrange, and only a slightly less particular type to carry out. She had the fire down to smolder by the time she heard hoofbeats. Everett rode in fast, genuinely fast, the first time she'd seen him move at anything other than a deliberate pace. And he pulled up at the fence line and was off his horse in a single movement and came to where she was standing with her empty buckets and her coat singed at the hem and her hair loose around her shoulders and her face probably telling him everything about what the last 20 minutes had been. He looked at the charred fence line. He looked at her. He looked at the fence line again. "How long ago?" he said. "I woke up maybe 30 minutes ago. It was already burning. You did this yourself. There was no one else." He was quiet for a moment, and she could see something working in him. Something that was not his professional assessment of the situation. Something underneath that. "Are you hurt?" "No, my coat's ruined," he exhaled. "Good." Then after a beat, "About the coat, or—" "I know what you meant." He looked at her for a long moment in the dark, and then he said quietly, "I should have been closer." "You can't sleep in my yard, Everett." "No," he said, "I know." But he looked like a man who was reconsidering the logistics of that position. She sat down on the fence rail, the undamaged section, because her legs had decided they'd had enough of performing steadiness and wanted to simply stop for a moment. Everett sat next to her, not touching, not filling the silence with anything. Above them, the late summer sky was enormous and densely starred in the way of Kansas skies that had no competition from any other light source for 50 miles. And the smell of charred grass was already beginning to thin in the still air. "He's trying to scare me," she said. "Yes." "It's working," she said. "I want you to know that. I'm frightened." That seems like the honest thing to say. She felt rather than saw him look at her. "You put out a fire at 2 in the morning alone," he said. "Frightened people do things," she said. "Being frightened doesn't mean you stop. It just means it costs more." He was quiet. Then, "That's true." "Is Rendecker—" "I'll deal with that," Everett said, and the flatness in his voice told her that Rendecker had missed something he should have caught, and that Everett was holding that particular reckoning for a private moment. "This goes in the file. Physical intimidation, property damage, arson. That's no longer civil fraud. That's criminal and federal." "Good," she said. "I'm going to need you to write down exactly what you saw tonight. Time. What the fire looked like when you first saw it. Which direction it appeared to start from." "I'll do it in the morning. Tonight, if you can. While it's exact." She looked at him. "It's 2 in the morning." "I know." He paused. "I'm sorry." "Don't apologize. You're right." She stood up, steadier now, her legs having apparently decided to cooperate again. "Come inside. I'll make coffee and write the statement." He came inside. She wrote the statement at the kitchen table while the coffee heated, and he read it over without correcting a word, which she took as the compliment it was. Outside, the night was quiet, genuinely quiet, the particular deep quiet of 3 in the morning in the Kansas countryside, which had a texture to it that was different from any other hour's silence. When she'd finished writing and he'd folded the paper away into his coat, neither of them stood up immediately. The coffee was still too hot to drink. The lamp on the table put a warm, limited circle of light around them, and outside that circle everything was dark and still. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You generally do whether I say yes or not," he said, which was the driest thing she'd heard him say in a month, and she felt the side of her mouth move. "Why did you become a sheriff?" He considered this the way he considered most things. Not quickly. "My father was a judge," he said. "Not a famous one. A circuit judge in a county smaller than this one. I watched him decide things for 20 years, and I watched what it cost him when the decision was the right one and the outcome was still wrong, because the law has gaps and people fall through them." He paused. "I decided I'd rather be the one closing gaps than the one trying to explain them." "And Dodge City?" she said. "Was that a gap?" He was quiet for a moment. "It was a failure," he said. "There's a difference. A gap is the system. A failure is mine." And you've been carrying it like yours ever since, she said. Not a question. Yes. Even when it's not, entirely? He looked at her. In the lamplight, the scar along his jaw was more visible than usual, and he looked tired in a way that went past the hour, tired in the way of someone who has been carrying something heavy for so long that the weight has simply become part of their normal. You're doing that thing you do, he said. What thing? Where you say something that I'm not sure how to respond to and then wait. I'm not waiting, she said. I'm just not filling the space unnecessarily. He looked at her for a long moment, and then, very quietly, he said, I know. And the way he said it, as if those two words were carrying a great deal more than their surface meaning, made her understand that they were not, in that moment, talking about gaps and failures in Dodge City anymore. She looked back at him. The coffee cooled between them. Everett, she said, I need to tell you something, and I'm going to say it plainly because I don't know any other way to say it, and we've been building toward it for a while, and I'm tired of not saying it. He waited. He was very still. I've fallen in love with you, she said. I don't say that to complicate things or to ask anything of you. I say it because it's true, and you deserve to know it, and I'm done keeping things to myself that matter. The silence that followed was the longest one they'd shared. Outside, something moved in the grass, the wind finally picking up, and the lamp flickered once and steadied. Adeline, he said. His voice was different, lower. Something in it she hadn't heard before, something that had been held back for a long time. I've loved you since the first winter you were here alone. Since I watched you patch your own fence in February snow and refuse every offer of help from 4 different neighbors. He stopped. I didn't say anything because I have a past that isn't simple and a job that isn't safe, and I thought you deserved someone whose history didn't have that kind of weight. She looked at him. That wasn't your decision to make, she said. That was mine. I know that now, he said. You've known it longer than now, she said. Yes, he admitted. I have. They sat with that for a moment, the acknowledged truth of it. Finally out in the open after weeks of careful proximity and deliberate restraint, sitting in the lamplight between them, like something that had always been there and had just now been given its right name. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. His hand was rough and warm, and he turned it over and held hers without making any production of it, the way he did most things, simply, practically, as if it were the obvious next step that had been waiting to be taken. Outside, the wind moved through the burned grass at the edge of the fence line. The night was quiet. Somewhere down the lane, his horse shifted its weight and exhaled. Neither of them spoke for a while. They didn't need to, but both of them knew, without saying it, that what had just been named would need to be protected the same way the land needed to be protected, carefully, stubbornly, against the pressure of people who wanted to take things that didn't belong to them. And both of them knew that Silas Crow was not finished. Not by a long measure. The fire at the fence line had not been a conclusion. It had been a signal, and signals like that were always followed by something larger. What came next would not be quiet, and it would not be simple, and they would not come through it without cost. But they would come through it together, and in the lamplight of that small cabin at 3 in the morning, with the smell of charred grass still faint in the air, that felt like enough. The federal marshal arrived on a Tuesday. His name was Caleb Marsh, and he came from Topeka on the morning stage without announcement, which was how Everett had arranged it. No prior word to anyone in Blackridge, no notice to the county sheriff's office in the next town over, no communication through any channel that Crow's people might have reason to monitor. He was a compact, weathered man in his late 40s with a gray mustache and the specific unhurried manner of someone who had been doing difficult work long enough that he no longer needed to perform urgency to feel it. He walked off the stage, looked at Everett, and said, "You've got more than I expected." "More than I expected, too," Everett said. They spent 3 hours in Everett's office with the door closed and Adeline's written statement, and Henderson's testimony, and May's letter, and the notes from the Cutler widow, and the Beecham account, and the surveyor's name and the banker in Wichita, all of it laid out on the desk in the order Everett had arranged it, chronological, cross-referenced, each piece annotated with its source and the names of anyone who could corroborate it. Marsh read everything twice. He asked 17 questions, and Everett answered 15 of them directly and acknowledged the gaps in the other 2 without trying to fill them with speculation, which Adeline, sitting in the corner again on the same upturned crate, noted was probably the right instinct. She had come to this meeting over Everett's mild objection. Not a strong objection, he'd said, "You don't have to be there," in the tone of someone stating a fact rather than issuing a preference. And she'd said, "I know, I want to be," and that had been the end of it. Marsh looked at her over the desk when Everett introduced her. "You're the Rowan property," he said. "I own the Rowan property," she said. "Yes?" Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, so not quite a smile, but an acknowledgement. "Fair correction." He looked back at Everett. "What's Crow's current whereabouts?" "He arrived in Blackridge 2 days ago. Took a room at the Granger Hotel under his own name, which tells you something about his confidence level." "Or his arrogance," Marsh said. "In my experience, those are the same thing at this scale," Everett said. Marsh tapped the edge of Henderson's testimony. "The letter is the strongest piece. The rest builds context, but the letter is what I can take to a judge." He paused. "I need Bellard on record. Complete record. Not the partial statement you got from him before." Everett's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. "He'll resist." "He'll resist until he understands his alternative," Marsh said. "What's his exposure?" "Conspiracy to defraud, possibly. Depends on how the arrangement is characterized." "Then he has a decision to make." Marsh folded his hands on the desk. "I'll speak to him myself. Sometimes it lands differently coming from a federal badge." It did land differently. Adeline learned this the following morning, from Everett, who had been present for the conversation, and described it with his characteristic economy. Marsh had sat across from Thomas Bellard in a room at the marshal's temporary office, which was, with no small irony, the back room of the same community hall where the harvest dance had been held 6 weeks earlier, and had explained in precise and undramatic terms exactly what Thomas Bellard's legal situation looked like from the perspective of the federal government. Bellard had gone pale. Then he'd asked for water. Then he'd talked for an hour and 40 minutes without stopping. He gave them everything. The initial contact from Heron, the debt that made him susceptible, the specific instructions about Adeline, her schedule, her vulnerabilities, the approach that had been designed around her particular circumstances as a woman alone on contested land. He gave them dates and amounts, and the name of the intermediary who'd passed money from Crow's operation to Bellard through a feed merchant in the next county who had no idea what he was carrying. He cried, at one point. Marsh, by Everett's account, had waited for it to pass and then continued with his questions. When Everett told her this, Adeline sat with the information for a moment. She thought about Thomas Bellard in the community hall, laughing with Clara Hutchins, the relaxed posture of a man who hadn't spent a single moment worrying. She thought about 6 weeks of quiet hope, carefully tended. She thought about the note. Something came up. "Won't be able to make it tonight." "Does he understand what he's done?" she said. "I think he's beginning to," Everett said. "That's not the same as having understood it when it mattered." "No," he agreed. "It's not." She didn't say anything else about Thomas Bellard. There was nothing else useful to say, and the part of her that wanted to say it anyway was the part she'd been managing for weeks. The part that was angry, and had every right to be, and still couldn't be allowed to drive. What drove, instead, was Marsh's timeline. He wanted to move within 48 hours before Crow received any indication that a federal officer was in town. Blackridge was small enough that news of a stranger's arrival would spread by the end of the day, but there was a difference between a man from out of town and a federal marshal, and Marsh intended to exploit that window before it closed. The problem was Cobb. Del Cobb had not been seen since the 2 men came to Adeline's yard with the $400 offer. Marsh wanted him accounted for before any move was made on Crow, because Cobb loose and unmonitored while his employer was being arrested was the kind of loose end that had a history of resolving itself badly. Everett had 2 deputies, Ren Decker, who had redeemed himself somewhat by working double shifts since the fence fire with the anxious dedication of a man aware he owed a debt, and a younger man named Foss who was reliable in the specific sense of doing exactly what he was told and nothing more complicated. "I need Cobb located," Everett told them both. "Not approached. Located. I want to know where he is and what direction he's pointing before Tuesday afternoon." Decker went east, Foss went south, and Everett rode to the Granger Hotel. He didn't go inside. He stood across the street for 20 minutes, in the shadow of the hardware store's awning, watching the comings and goings with the patience of a man who had learned that watching was half the work. He saw Heron come out of the hotel at 10:15 and walk quickly toward the telegraph office, which was interesting. He saw one of the two men who'd come to Adeline's yard sitting on the hotel porch with a newspaper he didn't appear to be reading. He did not see Cobb. He was still watching when Adeline appeared beside him. He looked at her. "I didn't ask you to come." "You didn't tell me not to," she said. "Heron just went to the telegraph office." "I saw." "If he's sending word to anyone, Marsh has someone watching the telegraph office," Everett said. "Every message out of Blackridge today gets logged." She looked at him. "You planned for that." "Marsh planned for that. I suggested it." She turned back to the hotel. The man on the porch had put down his newspaper and was looking at something down the street with an attention that was slightly too focused to be casual. "The one on the porch," she said quietly. "He's watching something." Everett followed her sightline. "A beat." "Yes," he said, and his voice had changed slightly, tighter, more internal, the voice of a man who has just seen something click into place. "He's watching the South Road." "Why the South Road?" "Because that's the road from the Rowan property," he said, and turned to her with an expression she hadn't seen before. Not alarm, he was too controlled for alarm, but something very close to it. "Where's your place right now? Is anyone there?" "It's empty. I've been here since—" "Go to Marsh," he said. "Tell him Cobb may be at the Rowan property. Go now, directly. Don't walk past the hotel." "Everett, Adeline." The way he said her name had weight in it. "Please." She went. Marsh's reaction to the information was the reaction of a man who had been half expecting something like this. He stood up from the table, put on his coat, and said, "Where's Kane?" in the tone of someone who had already begun moving forward in his head and needed the physical world to catch up. "Across from the hotel," she said. "Tell him I'm taking Foss and going to the Rowan property. He stays on Crow." "I'm coming, Miss Rowan." Marsh looked at her with an expression that was not unkind but was absolutely inflexible. "I need you in this building until this is resolved. You're the central witness in a federal case. If something happens to you before we have Crow in custody, the entire case loses its anchor." She opened her mouth, closed it. The logic was impeccable, and she hated it. "Fine," she said, "but if there's damage to the property, we'll deal with that when we get there." She found Everett, delivered Marsh's message, and watched him absorb it with a nod that acknowledged both the plan and the reason she wasn't part of it. And then she went back inside the community hall and sat at the table where Thomas Bellard had given his statement the day before. And she waited. Waiting was the hardest thing she'd done in this entire sequence of hard things. She was not a patient woman by nature. She was a woman who had learned to perform patience because the alternative was chaos, and there was a difference. She sat at the table and she looked at the walls and she thought about Del Cobb, who had gone to the Beecham farm in the middle of the night, and described, calmly, what happened to families who were stubborn. She thought about what a man like that did when he arrived at an empty property and found no one there to threaten. She thought about her father's ledger, still on the kitchen table. She thought about the little leather book he'd given her at 18, the one she'd been keeping her accounts in for 9 years. She thought, with a specific and furious clarity, that if Del Cobb put a hand on anything in that cabin, she was going to have a great deal to say about it to everyone involved. The hour passed with the specific cruelty of hours that are not going quickly enough. Foss came back first, alone, on foot, coming in through the back of the building, and she stood up from the table before he'd cleared the doorway. "Property's intact," he said, slightly out of breath. "Cobb was there. He was in the barn." "Was?" "Marshal Marsh has him. He's—" "It didn't go quietly," Foss said, with the expression of a young man who had witnessed something he was still processing. "But nobody's hurt. Marshall's bringing him in." She sat back down. The relief moved through her like something physical. Not pleasant, exactly. More like the sudden absence of a pressure she'd been sustaining so long she'd stopped feeling it as pressure and started feeling it as normal. "The barn," she said. "He was in the barn." "Yes, ma'am. Waiting, it looked like." "Waiting for me to come home." Foss looked at the floor. "Yes, ma'am. That's what it looked like." She sat with that for a moment. Then she stood up, straightened her coat, and said, "Where's Sheriff Kane?" Everett was still across from the hotel when she found him, but the situation had changed. Marsh had sent word through a fast rider, and Everett now had a specific window. Crow was in his hotel room, Heron had returned from the telegraph office and gone upstairs, and the man on the porch had gone inside 20 minutes ago. The building was as consolidated as it was going to get. "Cobb's in custody," she told him. Something moved across his face. Relief, quickly contained. "Good. Marsh?" "On his way back." "Then we move now before Heron's telegraph gets a response." He looked at Decker, who had returned from the East Road 20 minutes prior. "With me." The arrest of Silas Crow was not, by any standard of drama, what Adeline had imagined it would be. She had imagined, when she'd allowed herself to imagine it at all, which she'd tried not to do because imagining outcomes was a way of building attachment to versions of events that reality rarely honored, something confrontational. Some final, clarifying scene in which the man who'd set all of this in motion was revealed to be what he was in a moment of high, visible consequence. What actually happened was that Everett knocked on the door of room 7 at the Granger Hotel at 2:15 in the afternoon, and Silas Crow opened it in his shirt sleeves with the wary, calculating expression of a man who had been in difficult situations before and was already running through his options. And Everett said, "Mr. Crow, I have a federal warrant for your arrest on charges of land fraud, criminal conspiracy, and arson." And Crow looked at the warrant and looked at Everett and looked at Marsh standing behind him and said, in a voice that was almost admirably controlled, "I'll need my attorney." "You'll have that opportunity," Marsh said. "Come with us, please." And that was it. No raised voice, no dramatic denial. Just a man who had built an empire of pressure and manipulation and fear, standing in a hotel room in shirt sleeves, and a warrant that was heavier than he was. Heron was taken from the room next door. It was less controlled, he argued briefly, with the energy of a man who had spent years making other people believe his arguments and had not yet updated his understanding of the current situation. Marsh let him argue for approximately 90 seconds, and then interrupted him with a precision that suggested he'd done this many times, and the arguments always went the same way. Adeline was standing in the street when they brought them out. Crow saw her. She hadn't planned to be there. She'd followed at a distance, telling herself she was simply walking in the same direction and that she had a right to be on any street in this town. But she was there, and he saw her, and for a moment they looked at each other. He was not what she'd built him into, in the months of fear and anger. He was a man in late middle age, fine-featured, with the kind of face that had probably been charming at 40 and was now just well-maintained. He looked at her with the expression of a man making a rapid assessment and finding it, for once, unfavorable to himself. She held his gaze and didn't look away, and after a moment he did, and that was the only satisfaction she took from the moment, and it was enough. The days that followed were quieter than she'd expected, and more complicated. There were statements to give, formal ones, to Marsh, in the back room of the community hall, with a man from the Attorney General's office writing everything down in a hand that moved with the efficient speed of someone who had heard a great deal of testimony and treated none of it as remarkable. She gave her statement twice. Marsh asked the same questions from different angles, which she understood was not distrust, but method, and she answered with the same precision both times, because precision was the only thing she had to offer that was more valuable than passion. Henderson gave his statement, complete this time, with May sitting beside him and her hand on his arm. He was steadier than he'd been. Not comfortable exactly, but present in a way he hadn't been when he'd first sat at her table and turned his hat in his hands. The act of speaking had done something to him, she thought. Not healed anything, not yet, not the sale of his wife's land or the grave under the cottonwoods. But it had returned something to him that had been absent since the fence fire and the horses and the quiet, grinding surrender. Thomas Bellard's testimony, it emerged, was the piece that tied the case cleanest. He had names, dates, specific instructions, a precise account of the payment structure, all of it delivered in the flat, exhausted tone of a man who had finished calculating and accepted the math. He would face consequences. Marsh was clear on that, reduced in exchange for the cooperation, but not eliminated. Bellard nodded when he was told this, and said nothing, and looked at the table. Adeline was not present for that conversation. She had decided, after some thought, that she didn't need to be. She'd said what needed to be said to Thomas Bellard on the street outside the dry goods store, and she'd said it without cruelty and without sentiment, and that was enough. Whatever accounting he made with himself was his own business. What occupied her, in the days while the legal machinery ground forward, was something smaller and more immediate, her property. She went home the evening of Crow's arrest, and walked the perimeter of the fence line in the late afternoon light. The burned section was perhaps 40 feet, blackened and broken at the posts. The barn was undisturbed. Cobb had apparently been careful not to leave evidence of his presence beyond his own being there, which was its own kind of chilling professionalism. The cabin was as she'd left it, her father's ledger still on the kitchen table, the little leather account book beside it. She stood in the middle of the yard for a while, looking at everything. The 20 acres looked the same as it always had. Dry creek, thin soil, nothing spectacular about any of it from the outside. But she was looking at it differently now, with the knowledge of what her father had understood and what it had cost to protect it, and the land looked in the slanted evening light like something that had been worth every bit of what it had taken. Everett arrived an hour later, without knocking, the way he'd been arriving for weeks. He came around the side of the cabin and found her still in the yard and stopped when he saw her face. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. "I'm just looking at it." He came to stand beside her, and he looked at it too, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "Marsh is satisfied," he said. "He thinks the case is strong enough that Crow's attorney won't want to go to trial. Expects a negotiated outcome, full disclosure of the land operation, restitution to the sellers. Henderson's wife's land. He'll push for restoration of the deed. Can't promise it, but he'll push." She exhaled. It wasn't relief, not entirely. More like the beginning of something. The first clear weather after a long gray period, still uncertain, still carrying the memory of the gray. And Cobb? Federal holding, arson, criminal intimidation, conspiracy. He won't be negotiating anything. Everett paused. "He wasn't, it turns out, waiting for you to come home." She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "He was waiting for me." Everett said it steadily, without drama. Crow had given him a secondary instruction. If the primary effort on the property failed, neutralize the law enforcement obstacle. A pause. "That would be me." The information landed on her with a weight she wasn't prepared for. She stood with it for a moment, feeling the specific vertigo of a consequence she hadn't seen coming and couldn't entirely absorb in the moment she received it. He wasn't going to succeed, Everett said. "Everett, that's not—" She stopped, pressed her lips together, started again. "You didn't tell me that before." "No." "Why?" He looked at her. "Because there were things that needed doing and I needed you focused on them." "That's not a good enough reason." "No," he agreed. "It's not. I'm telling you now." She wanted to be angry about this. She had, she realized, a legitimate case for anger. She had been asking for honesty from the beginning, had offered it herself without reservation, had built this entire partnership on the assumption that both of them were operating with complete information. And he had withheld something significant, and he knew it, and the fact that he was telling her now without hedging or excuse was the only thing keeping her anger from reaching its full height. "Don't do that again," she said. "I won't," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. He held her gaze with the particular steadiness of a man who is not defending himself because he knows the defense is inadequate and has decided that acknowledging the inadequacy is more honest. "I was frightened for you," she said. "I need you to understand that. Whatever I said about being frightened and still functioning, that applies to you too. More so." "I know," he said, and then quieter. "I'm sorry." It was a genuine apology. Not the reflexive kind, not the diplomatic kind, but the kind that came from a real acknowledgement of a real failure, and she accepted it the same way, without minimizing it, and without extending it beyond its actual dimensions. "All right," she said. They stood in the yard as the light continued to fall, and the evening came in the slow, warm way of August evenings in Kansas, and around them the 20 acres sat in the gathering dusk looking exactly like what it was. Ordinary land that had been worth a great deal to a great many people, for reasons that had nothing to do with its surface and everything to do with what was coming. "The railroad survey," she said. "When does it come through?" "Marsh says the crew is already commissioned. Few months, maybe. They'll confirm the corridor, file the report, and then it's official." "And the land?" "Worth considerably more than $400, he said, with the ghost of something in his voice that was almost dry. "My father knew," she said. "He knew it was coming. He had to have heard something, or worked it out. The man with the gold watch chain, the approaches. He put it together." And held. And held, she said. Stubborn old man. She said it with a softness that had nothing stubborn in it. I used to think it was just his nature, that he couldn't let go of things. The land, the idea of the land. I thought it was sentiment. It was strategy, Everett said. It was both, she said. That's the part I didn't understand. You can be sentimental about something and still be right about it. Those aren't opposites. He looked at her. No, he said. They're not. The last light was going now, softening everything. She turned to face him, and he turned to face her, and they were close in the way they'd become comfortable being close. Not cautiously, not with the careful management of proximity that had characterized the early weeks, but with the ease of people who have decided, without ceremony, that the distance between them is unnecessary. I've been thinking, he said. About? He looked at her. He was not a man who decorated things, who dressed words in more than they needed, and she'd come to understand that as its own form of care, that the plainness of his speech was not absence of feeling, but the opposite, a refusal to dilute. About what happens after this, he said. After Marsh, after the trial, after everything settles. What this looks like then. And, she said. And I'd like it to look like this, he said. Whatever this is. I'd like it to continue. She looked at him. That's a very careful way of saying something. I'm a careful man. You're asking me something, she said. Yes, he said. I am. She held his gaze. The yard was nearly dark now, and the first stars were showing above the eastern tree line, and somewhere down the fence line the charred post stood in the dusk, like the evidence of something survived. Ask me plainly, she said. You can do that. You've done it before. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Will you marry me? Not a question. A statement, almost, delivered in the same register as everything else he said. Direct, unembellished, with the weight of something he'd been carrying for a while and had now simply set down. She looked at him for a long moment. Yes, she said. Same register, same weight. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then he put his hand out, and she took it, and they stood in the dark yard of 20 acres that had cost them both something considerable to keep, and the night settled around them with the particular quiet of a Kansas evening that has run out of weather. And it was not romantic in the way that things in stories are romantic. It was real and imperfect and solid in the way that only things which have been tested can be solid. Above them, the stars accumulated. The burned fence posts stood where they were. The cabin held its light. They stayed in the yard for a long time, and neither of them needed to say anything more. And so they didn't. The trial, when it finally came, was held in Topeka in the second week of November, when the Kansas sky had gone the particular flat gray of late autumn, and the wind off the plains had enough bite in it to make a person walk faster than they intended. Adeline took the stage from Blackridge on a Monday morning with a small bag and her father's ledger and the composed expression of a woman who had been preparing for this specific day for 3 months and was not going to let it find her unprepared. Everett rode alongside the stage on horseback. He had business with Marsh before the proceedings began, and he also, she understood without him saying it, was not going to let her make that journey alone. The courthouse in Topeka was larger than anything in Blackridge, with high ceilings and a smell of old wood and institutional paper that reminded her of nothing in her previous experience, which she supposed was the point. Authority had a particular architecture. She sat in the witness chair on Tuesday afternoon and answered questions for 2 hours in the same flat, precise voice she'd used giving statements to Marsh. And she watched Silas Crow's attorney try 3 different angles of approach, and find none of them gaining traction, because she had told the truth in the same words every time she'd been asked. And the truth, told consistently, was a remarkably difficult thing to erode. Crow sat at the defense table in a good coat and watched her with the expression of a man recalculating. She looked at him twice during her testimony, once when she first took the chair, once when she finished, and both times she held the look long enough to establish that she was not afraid of being looked at, and then she returned her attention to the questions. Henderson testified the following morning. May came with him, sat in the gallery, and watched her father find a voice she'd apparently never heard him use. Steady and specific and without apology, a man who had arrived late to the right side of something and was determined to be useful now that he was there. He made no dramatic statements. He simply described what had happened to him and what he knew, in order, with dates where he had them, and honest uncertainty where he didn't, Marsh had been right about the attorney. By Thursday, the defense had begun quiet conversations about a negotiated resolution. And by Friday afternoon, Silas Crow had entered an agreement that involved a full disclosure of every land transaction in the corridor, restitution payments to every seller who had been coerced, and a period of federal supervision that would, in practical terms, end his operation in Kansas permanently. He did not go to prison, which was the outcome that bothered Adeline the most, and she said so to Everett that evening in their room at the boarding house near the courthouse. "He has enough money to buy a better outcome than he deserves," she said. "Yes," Everett agreed. He was sitting on the edge of the bed unlacing his boots, and he didn't try to dress that fact up into something more palatable. "But the operation is finished. The money goes back. The land goes back where it can." "Where it can," she repeated. "Henderson's wife's land?" Marsh pushed for it. "The buyer, the one Crow sold it to, is contesting the restitution. It'll take longer." He set one boot down. "It may not come back the way Owen wants it." She sat with that for a moment. It was one of the things she'd come to understand over the past months, that justice, in practice, was not the clean equation it presented itself as in principle. It was negotiated, partial, dependent on the willingness of people and institutions to press past the point of comfortable resolution. Sometimes the grave under the cottonwood stayed in the wrong hands because the legal mechanism ran out of leverage before it ran out of injustice. "He'll grieve that," she said. "He's already grieving it," Everett said. "But he stood up. He testified. Whatever happens with the land, he knows he did that. Is that enough?" Everett looked at her. "I don't know," he said. "Sometimes it is. Sometimes it isn't. That's not something I can fix." It was one of the things she'd come to love about him, the refusal to offer comfort that was really just evasion. He looked at hard things directly and said what he saw. And if what he saw wasn't hopeful, he didn't pretend it was. In a world full of people who would rather be kind in the moment than honest over time, that quality had a value she kept discovering in new places. They were married 2 weeks after they returned from Topeka, on a Thursday morning in November that was cold enough to see your breath and clear enough to see for 20 miles in any direction. The ceremony was held in the community hall, the same building where the harvest dance had been, the same building where Bellard had given his statement, the same building that had served, over the last 3 months, as witness room and marshal's office, and now, with considerably less dramatic purpose, a place where two people stood in front of their neighbors and said the plain things that needed saying. Adeline wore the dress with the cream-colored collar and the pearl buttons she'd sewn on herself. She had not planned that. She'd thought, initially, about something new, something that didn't carry the memory of that August evening when she'd stood in front of her mirror and refused to cry. But when she'd held this dress in her hands the week before, she'd found she didn't want to put it away. She wanted to wear it into something better. Wanted to take the night it came from and lay something else over it, something that would change what the dress meant when she thought about it later. That was, she'd decided, a thing worth doing. Everett wore his good shirt, the dark gray one without the badge. He stood at the front of the hall and watched her walk toward him with an expression she'd never seen on his face in any other context. Not soft, exactly. He was not a soft-faced man, but open, the professional blankness entirely gone, something underneath it visible in a way she suspected very few people had ever seen. The vows were short. The minister, who was a practical man with little patience for performance, kept it functional and sincere, and neither of them had asked for anything more elaborate than that. When it was done, May Henderson cried. Owen Henderson blew his nose loudly into a handkerchief and pretended he hadn't. Clara Parrish, who had offered her spare room at the worst moment of all this, squeezed Adeline's arm and said, "Finally," in a tone that suggested she'd been waiting for this conclusion with some impatience. Ren Decker, who had spent the last 3 months working double shifts out of a guilt that he had not once mentioned directly and also had not stopped feeling, shook Everett's hand for a long time without saying anything, and Everett let him. The celebration afterward was modest. Coffee, food that 6 different families had contributed, a fiddle player who was considerably better than the one at the harvest dance, and seemed to understand he was there to provide background rather than spectacle. People talked and ate and said the ordinary things that people say at weddings, and Adeline moved through it with the particular feeling of a woman who is present in a moment and also somehow slightly above it, watching it, trying to fix it in memory. At one point, she found herself standing near the door with Owen Henderson, both of them holding coffee cups and watching the room, and he said, "Your father would have liked him." She looked at him. "Did you know my father well?" "Well enough," Henderson said. "He was stubborn, and he was right, which is a combination that doesn't always go together, and when it does, you hold on to it." He looked at his coffee. "I should have been more like him." "You're here," she said. Same thing Everett had said to him months ago. It still seemed like the right response. Henderson looked at her. Then he looked across the room at May, who was laughing at something the fiddle player had said, and something in his face did a complicated thing that moved toward peace without quite arriving there. "Yes," he said. "I'm here." The winter settled over Blackridge with the businesslike efficiency of Kansas winters, which didn't bother with drama and simply arrived and stayed. Adeline and Everett were married, which changed some things and left others exactly as they'd been. She still ran her place with the same precision, still kept her accounts in the leather ledger, still had the stubbornness that had been her father's gift to her, and was now her own. He still came home at irregular hours, and sometimes didn't come home at all because the county didn't keep office hours, and she had understood from the beginning that his work was not the kind that respected domestic schedules, and she'd chosen it anyway with open eyes. They had arguments. That was the honest version of the story. They were two people with strong opinions about most things, and opinions that strong produced friction, the same way two good pieces of flint produce sparks, and sometimes the friction was productive, and sometimes it was just friction. He was too private about his worries, kept them contained past the point of useful containment. She was too quick to handle things herself before he could offer help, which he sometimes experienced as exclusion, and said so, badly, and then they would have the conversation about it again with slightly better language than the time before. They got better at it, slowly, imperfectly, the way people get better at things that actually matter. The railroad survey came through in the spring, confirming the corridor exactly as Crow's intelligence had indicated. The land values along the route shifted almost immediately. Not dramatically, not overnight, but with the steady, real-world weight of something that was actually going to happen. The 20 acres that Adeline's father had bought for less than the price of a good horse was now worth more than most people in the county would see in a decade. She did not sell. This surprised some people who thought the rational conclusion to surviving a land fraud conspiracy was to take the profit the land now offered. She heard the argument several times, from neighbors who meant well, and from one cousin who did not particularly mean well but said it anyway, and her answer was always some version of the same thing. Her father had known what the land would be worth, and had held it anyway, not for the money, but because holding it was the right decision in each moment when he was asked to stop holding it, and she intended to do the same. What she did do was build. The following year, with the money from the mending work and the small but real income from the land lease she'd arranged with a neighboring farmer for the portion she wasn't using, she opened a general store on the main street of Blackridge. It was a modest operation to begin with, a rented building, second-hand shelving, stock chosen with the care of someone who had been keeping precise accounts her entire adult life and understood the relationship between what people needed and what they'd actually pay for. She ran it with the same practical exactness she'd applied to everything else, and within a year it was reliably profitable, and within 3 years it was the kind of establishment that people from 2 towns over came to specifically. She was good at it. She had not known she would be, hadn't planned for it. It had arrived out of necessity and turned out to be a fit, the way some things do when you stop trying to engineer your life into a particular shape and let it find its own. Everett watched this with a pride he expressed in the same way he expressed most things, economically, without fanfare. He came by the store most evenings before heading home, stood at the counter, and drank whatever coffee she had left, and listened to what had happened that day. He was interested in the details in the way of someone who genuinely wanted to know, not to advise or direct, just to know. That distinction mattered to her. She'd met enough men in her life who listened to women's affairs in order to weigh in on them, and very few who listened simply because they found the person worth listening to, who was still, fundamentally, the same man he'd been standing on her porch in his good shirt in August, deliberate, plain-spoken, careful with his judgments, carrying his Dodge City weight, in the particular private way of someone who has accepted that some things don't get lighter but can be accommodated. He had nightmares occasionally, which she had learned not to treat with too much solicitousness because that made them harder for him, and to simply be awake and present when they happened, which seemed to help in some practical and inexplicable way. He was not easy to know, fully. He had rooms in himself he didn't open readily, and she'd stopped trying to force the locks, not out of resignation, but out of the understanding that some interior doors open on their own timeline, and forcing them produces only a damaged door. She waited. Sometimes he opened them. Sometimes he didn't. She'd learned to live with the ones that stayed shut. The first child was born in the winter of 1886, a boy they named James after her father, which was Everett's suggestion, offered quietly one evening and accepted without discussion because there was nothing to discuss. The name was right, and they both knew it. James Rowan Kane was born at 4 in the morning during a sleet storm that had knocked out half the fence line on the east side of the property, which Adeline found bleakly funny in a way she couldn't fully explain to anyone but Everett, who understood immediately and laughed in the way he rarely laughed, openly, without managing it. A girl followed 2 years later, then another boy 3 years after that. The children were distinct from each other in every way that mattered, and both of their parents were relieved by this, having had no particular interest in producing replicas of themselves or each other. James was quiet and watchful, his father's son in temperament, the kind of child who observed a situation completely before participating in it. The girl, Ruth, was Adeline's stubbornness wearing a smaller face and considerably louder. The youngest, Daniel, was neither of these things. He was his own arrangement entirely, sociable and easily distracted and fundamentally optimistic in a way that Adeline suspected came from no particular parent, and was simply his own original contribution to the family's available characteristics. She raised them on the 20 acres, and in the rooms above the store, and in the general complicated mess of a family that is functioning without being uncomplicated. She taught them what she knew about accounting and what she believed about honesty, which was that it was the only foundation that held under real weight, that you could build almost anything on it, but without it, eventually, the structure would reveal the absence. Everett taught them, in his way, what he knew about consequence, about the relationship between the choices people make and the lives those choices produce, about the fact that the people who harmed others rarely looked like the versions of harm that stories prepared you for, that harm wore ordinary clothing and told you it was for your own good, and the defense against it was not innocence but attention. It was not a perfect education. No education is. Ruth rebelled against most of it between the ages of 14 and 17, with the comprehensive energy of someone who needed to find out for herself, which Adeline privately respected even when it was exhausting. James carried his father's tendency toward excessive self-sufficiency into his adult life, and had to learn, the hard way, that accepting help was not weakness, a lesson Everett had needed to learn too, and which created between them, father and son, a particular understanding that didn't require words. Daniel made decisions that alarmed everyone at regular intervals, and turned out fine in ways nobody had predicted, which was, perhaps, its own kind of lesson. The years built themselves in the ordinary way, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, always carrying more than was visible on the surface. Everett's work took him further as his reputation built. He dismantled 2 more land fraud operations in the years after Crow, smaller, less sophisticated, but operating on the same model of pressure and patience, and the exploitation of people who were too isolated or too afraid to resist alone. He was offered positions in larger towns, twice, and declined them both without apparent difficulty, which surprised people who didn't know him well and made complete sense to Adeline, who did. He had come to Blackridge to close gaps. The gaps were here. He came home each time with the same quietness he'd left with, and she'd learned to give him a day before asking about it. Not because she didn't want to know, but because he needed the transition, needed to move from the place where he did that work back to the place where he was simply Everett, which was a different and probably more demanding role than people gave it credit for. He retired from the sheriffship in 1901 at 52, when his deputy had become capable enough and trustworthy enough to hand the work to without it being a compromise. He did it without ceremony, which suited him, and he came home on a Tuesday afternoon in April and sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he'd first read Henderson's testimony, where Adeline had written her statement at 3 in the morning with charred grass still faint in the air. And he looked at her and said, "I think I'm done." She set down what she was doing and looked at him. "How does that feel?" He considered it honestly. "Strange," he said. "Good strange. Mostly." "You'll find things to do," she said. "I know," he said. I intend to be an inconvenience to everyone in this family for a considerable time yet." She laughed. She laughed the way she'd laughed that first night walking to the harvest dance, without having to think about it first. It was a morning in the late summer of the following year when Adeline stood at the door of the general store before opening, with her coffee and the particular quality of early light that comes in August in Kansas, amber and slightly hazy, and found herself thinking about the woman she'd been on the evening of August 23, 1883. 19 years ago. The dress with the pearl buttons, the note in thirds, the hairpin in her hand. She thought about what that woman had expected from her life, and what it had turned out to be instead. The thing was, and she'd thought about this enough that she'd arrived at something close to a settled opinion on it, the thing was that the worst moment had not been the moment it looked like. It had felt at the time like the closing of a door. The particular humiliation of being discarded, of having been used and then set aside, of being the woman nobody chose. She had stood in her cabin and pressed her lips together and refused to cry and told herself he wasn't worth it, and all of that was true, but underneath it was the real thing, the thing she hadn't let herself say. She had been afraid that the note confirmed something she'd been trying not to believe about herself, that she was someone life happened to rather than someone who made things happen, that the quiet, careful existence she'd built after her father's death was not a life she was living, but a life she was surviving, and that there was a difference, and she wasn't sure she'd been on the right side of it. What the next months had shown her was that she'd been wrong about which side she was on. Not because everything had gone well, it hadn't, not cleanly, not without cost. The fence fire, the 2 men in the yard, the nights of watching and waiting, the trial, the things that hadn't been restored and never would be. None of that was clean, but she had not been passive inside it. She had dressed anyway. She had opened the door. She had stood in the shadow behind the shed and listened and understood what she was hearing. She had told Everett what she knew and said, "What do we do?" rather than "What will you do?" And that distinction had defined everything that followed. She thought about May Henderson with her hands flat on the table, deciding to trust someone. She thought about Owen Henderson finding a voice he hadn't used in years. She thought about Thomas Bellard, who had been weak in the specific way that weak people are weak. Not malicious at the root, just insufficient, just unable to hold his shape against the pressure of someone else's agenda, and who had at the last moment done the one useful thing left to him. She didn't forgive him, exactly, but she'd stopped carrying him. There wasn't room for it anymore. She thought about her father, who had bought 20 acres of unremarkable land and loved it past the point of what anyone around him could understand, and who had been right, and who had not lived to see himself be right, which was the part that still caught her sometimes, the unfairness of it, the way life had that particular habit of letting people be correct too late. "You're thinking loudly," Everett said. She turned. He was standing behind her, also with coffee, having arrived with the same silence he'd always had, the movement of a man who had spent decades not announcing himself. "I didn't hear you come down," she said. "I know." He stood beside her in the doorway, looking at the street, Blackridge in the morning, the hardware store and the post office, and the 2 new buildings that had gone up in the last year. The evidence of the railroad's arrival in the form of modest prosperity that had changed the town's texture without changing its character. "What were you thinking about?" "August 1883, she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Long way from there." "Yes," she said. "It is." "Worth the distance?" She looked at him. He was looking at the street, coffee in hand, in the early morning light, 19 years older than the man who had stood on her porch in his good shirt and offered her a simple thing in a simple way and changed the direction of everything. He had lines at the corners of his eyes now, and more gray than not in his hair, and the scar along his jaw was part of the landscape of his face in a way it hadn't been when she first noticed it. He was not easier to know than he'd ever been. He was just better known. "Yes," she said. "Completely." He looked at her then. And she saw in his face the same thing she always saw there when he thought she wasn't watching. Not the controlled professional steadiness, not the careful blankness, but the real thing underneath, the thing that had been underneath since the beginning and had simply been waiting for enough safety to show itself. The part of Everett Kane that loved her in the plain, unheroic, durable way of a man who had decided on something and never reconsidered it. "Good," he said, and went back inside. She stayed in the doorway a little longer, with the amber light and the coffee and the morning street of a town that had grown up around the lives of people who had refused, one way or another, to be moved from what was theirs. She thought about what it cost to hold something, the attention it required, the refusal to be frightened past the point of action, the long, unglamorous work of building a life from the materials available rather than waiting for better materials that never quite arrived. Her father had known this. She had learned it. Her children were learning it now in their different ways, making their different mistakes, finding their different versions of the lesson that was essentially always the same lesson, that you could not control what came at you, only what you chose to do with it. And that choice, that specific daily, unremarkable choice, was the whole of it. The store opened at 8. She finished her coffee, set the cup inside, and turned the sign. The morning came in.